Do you remember the show Mythbusters that years ago was on TV? If you remember it, they took their expertise and they tried to investigate urban legends or stories or wives' tales to determine if they were true or not. And one of the things they tried to find is if they weren't true, let's try to bust the myth. You may remember some of them from the show. One of them is this: are bulls fearful of the color red? I mean, that's a myth you've heard for years. And the question is, are they or are they not? And the answer is false. They're actually not. Another one, let me throw this one out to you. Are bats blind? And you may say, oh, of course they are. I've heard that all my life. And the answer is they're actually not. That's another falsity. This is a good one for those in here who have halos on their head if you're watching. If you shave your hair, it will actually grow back thicker. And some of you are like, I know that one isn't true, right? Because I've tried it. And that's another falsity. Here's another one. Dogs can only see black and white. You've heard this one before. And the answer to that one is no, too. That one's false. The final one, I do this one all the time, and I've heard this from my mom growing up. If you keep cracking your knuckles, son, you're going to develop arthritis when you get older. You've heard that one. Is that true or false? And the answer is, once again, it's false. Now, why did we believe these myths? I want you to think back to growing up. One of the reasons we believe them is because someone taught them to us. Maybe someone who was an expert or a professor. Maybe we learned them through experience, maybe through life, or maybe we just perceived them and thought, you know what, that seems to be true. What if I told you today that some of the myths that you're believing in the church could actually be derailing your disciple-making ministry? You see, one of the things is every myth we believe is believed because it's repeated to us. It's taught consistently to us. It's the norm of the culture we live in. And what I want to show you today is that I am certain many of you are believing some of these myths, and the reason I know you're believing them is because I have as well. And so we're going to talk about 5 ministry myths that can derail a disciple-making movement. Now, as you're listening along, I want you to just say yay or nay. Hey, I believe that or am believing that now. And so the first one is this, write it down. The engagement myth. The engagement myth. And this is the myth that activity, listen, activity leads to transformation. I mean, Pastor, we assume that we have a lot of people on campus. The church is really busy, right? I mean, look at all the programs, look at all the people. In fact, look at all the signups. And so what we do is we measure collective activity instead of individual transformation. Now, I've been guilty of this as well. And here's the adage we play by. We play best in life where the scoreboard is the clearest, right? When we can see a clear scoreboard and we know what the score is, we play the best. Now, I'm going to submit to you that many of us today are playing by a scoreboard that is actually wrong. What do you mean, Robbie? Many of us are gauging success by the wrong scorecard. I mean, for example, in a church, how do you gauge success? If someone were to say, man, tell me about your church, what would you normally say? If you're like many people, it's the ABCs of church growth, right? Or church effectiveness. Attendance, buildings, and what? You know it. It's cash. The crazy thing is, Jesus never gauged success by any of those things, right? He didn't have a building to meet in or a building to sleep at. He didn't have a lot of people. In fact, at the end of his ministry, 120 in the book of Acts, nothing really to write home about. Outreach Magazine is not doing a church growth story on Jesus' ministry, and don't hear what I'm not saying. I'm not discounting the ministry of Jesus. What I'm saying is, he had to be on to something different, right? And then think of the finances. I mean, we know who Jesus put in charge of the traveling treasury, right? It was Judas, who there was a hole in it that leaked to his pocket. So what was effectiveness? What was success for Jesus? Before I tell you that, I want to just tell you a personal story about my former church. I was sitting on the front row about to get up and preach one Sunday. And I'm going over my notes at kind of a last minute before I go up and kind of in a mode of prayer. And George was sitting next to me, and bless his heart, George was one of those guys that actually I like to call a precious soul for whom Christ died. You know those guys, right? George sometimes had the gift of constructive criticism and used it liberally all the time. And George sat next to me and he leaned over and he had the bulletin in hand. And back then we had bulletins at church with the number of people in worship and the number of people in life group and the offering and the needs, right? And you probably have that or seen that. And George leans over to me and I look at him and I'm like, wow, George is really distraught over something. And George doesn't say a word. He just takes the bulletin and he circles with his finger the offering from last week. And he looks at me and it was lower than usual. And up to that point, we had had a pretty good trend of taking in more than we needed. But this week we were short and George looked over, he circled it and he looked at me and he whispered, we're gonna have to talk about this. And here I am getting ready to preach. Like if you're a preacher, you're getting ready to get up and I'm thinking, what is this guy doing? And I was tempted to be mad at George. I'm like, how would you even say this is something to gauge success by? I wanted to be mad. And then the Lord convicted me and I was reminded, Robbie, you actually taught George this, right? What do I mean? You actually trained George week in and week out what success was. Now, how did I do that? Well, I would get up naively every Sunday with the bulletin in hand, and when things were good, what would I say? Look at the back of the bulletin. We had more people in worship than last week. Let's give the Lord a hand. And then I'd say, look at the finances. We had more money this week than last week, or more money this year, and let's give the Lord a hand. And what I was showing them was this, that success was gauged by attendance and finances. Now, don't hear what I'm not saying. I'm not saying we shouldn't gauge those things. I'm not saying we should stop counting those things. What I'm saying is there is something more to count, something deeper to count. In fact, Jesus counted in a different way. And just remember as we go on here, you need to be reminded of this. What you celebrate as a pastor, leader, minister is what your people are going to replicate. So what you celebrate, they will replicate in the form of this is good or this is not good. So the question is this, what is the solution? And in every one of these myths, I'll present the myth and I'll offer a solution. The solution is to push the finish line back beyond activity into more of transformation, transforming a person. Now, how do we do this? We have an exercise at Replicate where we walk you through a dream disciple. And it's basically the kind of disciple you want to create. I tried this, first of all, years ago when I was with my former staff, and we were trying to decide the kind of person, the disciple we wanted to create. And I realized that if I didn't know where I was heading, I would never know when I got there. And I would never know how to gauge success, right? So I wanted to know what kind of disciple are we trying to create? And so with markers in hand and whiteboard behind me for weeks and weeks, my staff got tired of it after a while, we started to draw this picture that morphed into something like this. And obviously this is kind of a cartoony figure, but it proves the point. And I want to show you what this dream disciple is. This is a person who has a stamped passport in one hand. They have a worn out Bible in the other. They have their eyes looking to glorify God and their feet moving to the nations and their neighborhood. And we felt like if we could create this kind of disciple, this would be the kind of person we want filling the pews and padded seats of our churches. Let me ask you, if you'd say, man, Pastor, if we could have more like that, would that be a win in the church? And I think the answer would be yes. And let me just remind you, it's way more than just activity. It's way more than just attendance. It's way more than just participation in different kinds of programs. There's a guy in our church named Scotty. Scotty's become a friend of mine. In fact, Scotty texts me about 3 to 4, maybe 5 times a week. And we talk. He's about my age. And Scotty's been at our church now for about 2 years. He moved from California with his girlfriend, and Scotty and his girlfriend started coming to church, and Scotty was at every service. I mean, it was crazy. I would see him every week sitting in the same spot. He sits in the last row in the center section. He's all into the sermon. He's engaged. He's listening. At the end of every sermon that he comes to, he stands in line. And I'm telling you, 2 years, he's never missed a Sunday, him and his girlfriend. They'll stand in line. He'll say, man, amazing insight. I never heard that before. Scotty has not missed, since the beginning, a Wednesday night prayer gathering. He's been in every one. I mean, I would put Scotty up against any member. I'd put him up against any deacon, elder at Long Hollow. I mean, Scotty's attendance is flawless. Not to mention, Scotty actually has gone through ServeLink, which is our Connection Life Group ministry. He's gone through Starting Point, which is our ministry to get people engaged in the life of Long Hollow. Scotty has listened. This is wild to think about. Scotty has listened. He just finished last week. He's listened to every podcast that Chris Swain and I have ever done from the beginning. I mean, that's got to be 250. I don't know anybody. My wife hasn't listened to that many. I don't even think she listened to any. But anyway, Scotty's listened to them all. Now, here's the thing about Scotty. Scotty, activity-wise, checks all the boxes. But this is how Scotty introduces himself every time you meet him. I'm not making this up. In our next steps or in our ServeLink class or gathering, he'll walk up and say, hey, my name's Scotty and I'm an atheist. And people say, and he's not scared about it. He's not shy about it. My name's Scotty. I'm an atheist. You see, Scotty would be someone, if we use the scorecard of attendance and finances and participation and programming and even showing up for events, Scotty checks every box. And I would agree, or I think you would agree, that there are people in your churches that are just like Scotty. Now, the problem with Scotty is, although he meets the activity requirements, Scotty is not transformed by the gospel. Nobody would say that Scotty is a transformed believer. Now, we're excited that Scotty comes, but the point is we want Scotty to be transformed. I mean, you know this. Judas Iscariot himself would have passed the activity scorecard in many churches. I mean, Judas went out 2 by 2. He went out with the 72. Judas actually was in charge of the traveling treasury, but nowhere along the process was Judas transformed by the gospel. Let me just remind you of this as you think about the difference between activity and transformation. I believe at the end of time, when Jesus is going to look at the effectiveness, the efficiency, the success, if you will, of the church we led and pastored, he's not going to count the Christians within. He's going to weigh them. What do you mean? He's not going to just count how many people showed up, because we know from the Pharisees in Jesus' day, anybody could draw a crowd. The question is, what kind of maturity are the people who come to the church? What level of intimacy? How are they growing? What kind of fruit are they bearing? So we see that the activity scorecard is wrong. Now, we have a scorecard we use at Replicate, and it's called the Marks of a Disciple. And some maybe have heard about this, but it's M, missional, A, accountable, R, reproducible, C, communal, and S, scriptural. And we take that paradigm and we apply it as a filter to our people and our church. And obviously, if you take that scorecard and you apply it to the life of Scotty, Scotty doesn't check really any of these boxes. Now, pastor, leader, look at me. This is a hard pill to swallow, and we started here for a reason. You have to train yourself, like I'm constantly training myself, not to be impressed with successes that don't accomplish the goal or the mission. We need to train ourselves not to be impressed with successes that, man, look good and get a lot of accolades and tweets and retweets and articles in magazines, but don't accomplish the mission. Number 2, the second ministry myth is the expertise myth. And the expertise myth is the ministry excellence on one side versus excellent ministry on the other side. Ministry excellence versus excellent ministry. This is the idea in churches that if the trained seminary, graduating, ordained staff members who are paid don't carry out the ministry in our church, then it's never going to get done, right? Like if we don't do it, then it's not going to be done. And in most churches, like churches I've pastored, when I got here, we gauge success by the level of excellence of the ministry. So every year we were asking, did we have more at the women's gathering this year than last year? Did we do a better job hosting a conference this year than last year? Did we have more students at camp this year than last year? It was all event driven. Did we have more at the Wild Game dinner? Did we have more people engaged at the Man Up dinner? And it was on and on. Now, listen, again, don't hear what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that we are going to lessen the excellence of ministry. One of the hallmarks of our church is that we strive to do ministry with excellence. But don't let ministry excellence get in the way of empowering people from doing the ministry alongside of you. The question we have to ask is, how did we get here? Like, how did we get here through the ages where there's this chasm between the pew or the padded seats and the pulpit, between the trained ministers of the gospel or the leaders and the laity in the church? And there's probably a lot of answers, but I want to give you one. In 1611, the King James Version of the Bible was new and groundbreaking, and it became really the staple for the next 400 years. What people don't realize is that the King James Version was the Bible for 4 centuries. No Bible rivaled it. And I'm not against the King James, you gotta hear me. I love the King James. Just for disclaimer's sake, don't email me, don't send me a message. I love the King James, let me say on record. King James was written by, or translated by 48 different guys, 52 to be exact, but 48 guys over the course of 3 years, and then they edited for another 3 years, and then they divided it out over 3 different cities, Westminster, Cambridge, and Oxford, and then took 9 months to go to Listen, I love the King James Version. But one of the challenges back then is that the translators decided to add a comma in the translation, which I affectionately call the comma that's kept the church in a coma, discipleship coma, for 400 years. And that comma, as you know from the Greek language, is not in the text. Greek has no commas or punctuation or italics. And so this was a supplied insight by the translators, and I want to show you how this one comma changes everything. It's in Ephesians chapter 4, verses 11 through 13. Now I want to read to you the original King James, and I want to show you how it reads. And he gave some apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, and some pastors and teachers for the perfecting of the saints, watch this, comma, for the work of the ministry, comma, for the edifying of the body of Christ, until we all come to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, until a perfect man or woman, until the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. And so here's the question. Based on that rendering, what is the job or the work of the pastor, leader, minister of the gospel, the trained staff member at a church? Well, the answer is it's threefold, right? Number one, to perfect the saints. Number two, to do the work of the ministry. And number three, to edify the body of the Christ. And so the question is, who does all that? And the answer is the paid staff, the people we're actually paying to do the work. Now, here's the problem with that. Every modern translation from the early 1940s on corrects the I believe, misinsertion of the comma. In fact, just look at a modern translation. Everyone says it this way. And he gave the apostles, prophets, evangelists, shepherds, and teachers to equip the saints for the work of ministry, no comma, for the building up of the body of Christ until we all attain to the unity of the faith and the knowledge of the Son of God and to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. Now, here's what I want you to see. In this scenario, the job of the pastor is not to equip the saints, do the work of ministry themselves, and build up the body. The job of the pastor, leader, minister is to empower his or her people to be partners in the Great Commission, in the ministry together. And so it's not just you performing all the ministerial duties, it's actually you raising up pastors and leaders and godly men and godly fathers and godly mothers and students and people who are Christ honoring. Now, one of the things we are guilty of is this. We tend to do this often because we'll say, you know, when you get another degree under your belt, we'll let you teach a life group, right? When you get that certification, or you go to that prayer conference, or you go through this course, then and only then we'll feel ready to let you do ministry. And so here's how we have it. We have maturity comes before ministry, which I'm not saying it doesn't in a sense. But if you look at the text from Paul, Paul says this, and this is an interesting insight. It's actually ministry, I love this, ministry that leads to maturity. If you go back and look at the text, Ministry is actually the pathway to maturity. I'm not saying we put new believers in positions right away. I'm not saying you let unbelievers serve. But what I'm saying is this: there are some areas of maturity that we never, in a sense, attain to without going through ministry ourselves. Now, here's the test to determine if you're experiencing or seeing this in your church. Ask yourself the question, are we living out as a church the mission statement of our church? So are the people in my church living out and accomplishing the mission statement? Do we accomplish it and embody it, or is it just a pithy statement on the wall or a nice slogan on a coffee mug? We had a guy we were working with a couple months ago, and they basically were talking about mission statement and accomplishing and empowering people. And he said, hey, listen, I don't need any help with our mission statement. We have worked hard on it, and we don't need any help. Our people know it. They love it, and they are living this thing out. And our mission statement is, we are about connecting people to a relationship with Jesus Christ, basically. We're going to connect people into a growing relationship with Jesus Christ. And so one of the trainers looked at him and said, hey, I got a little assignment for you. You may be right, but let's not take assumptions. Let's take investigation. Let's investigate to see. And he said, why don't you go and ask 10 random people in your church this weekend the question, who is accomplishing the mission statement here at X Church? So at Long Hollow, who's accomplishing the mission statement at Long Hollow? So he comes back a couple weeks later and he says, well, I have to admit we have a major problem. And the consultant said, what do you mean you have a major problem? He said, well, the problem is every single person responded, oh, Pastor, that's easy. The person that's accomplishing the mission statement it's you. Like, you're the one we pay, right? You're supposed to accomplish the mission statement. See, what this does in a church where only the staff does the ministry, here's the problem. It leaves the church staff burnt out and overburdened. Now, I know you don't pastor a church and are part of a church where staff are overworked and burnt out and ready to throw in the towel, but I've heard of churches that are, right? And it's a joke, right? We all are in church environments like that. And what you do is, in this environment, you create a cul-de-sac for consumerism, where people just come and sit as spectators, where they never get on the field as participators. So here's the solution to that issue, that myth. The solution is you need to empower yourself and your staff to become hero makers. To become hero makers. Well, what do you mean? See, a hero maker is different than someone who wants to be a hero. See, instead of your staff being the heroes of the ministry, their job is to make the people or empower the people to be the heroes of the ministry. Think of it this way. They're not the star player. Your staff become the coaches that are in the background who get excited when they see people on the field serving Jesus and advancing the Great Commission. Now, this all will ride, and you have to understand this rides on the back of a compelling mission statement. And the key word there is compelling. And some of you are saying, well, mission statement, I don't even know what you're talking about, much less compelling mission statement. And that would be where I start. But once you have a compelling mission statement, you realize, man, this is something not only can our staff get involved in, but this is something our people can get behind. We were talking with one church staff at New Beginnings Church, and they shared this mission statement with their people. For the first time, they were kind of unfolding this to the church, and here's what the statement said. Our mission statement is people connecting people to Jesus in his ever restorative life where they live, work, and play. It's a really cool statement. Connecting people to Jesus in his ever restorative life where they live, work, and play. After the pastor shared it, one of the key leaders stood up and said, Pastor, and here's what he said, I quote, I cannot hide behind a mission statement like that. I am responsible now to be a part of the church's mission. Let me ask you, do you have a compelling mission statement that gets people off the bench and in the game? Number 3, the third myth is the equipping myth. This is the myth that believes teaching will actually lead to training. And just because we teach, then man, we have to be training and equipping people. And I'll begin with a question. Does anybody who's listening, would anybody say, hey, I just learned a new hobby. I just learned a new pastime. I just learned a new skill, right? Maybe it's disc golf, like me. Maybe it's woodworking. Maybe it's ham radios. I don't know. Maybe it's guitar playing or magic tricks or cooking. Let's just say cooking, something I don't do. But let's just say somebody would say, hey, I'm just learning how to cook. I want you to go back to when you first desired to be a cook or learn how to cook. I want you to walk through in your mind just kind of the steps to learning a new skill. The first thing is you would maybe get on the internet and learn some information or watch YouTube videos. And so you would learn things. And then secondly, you would start to spend a little time in the kitchen and study food and content and spices and the way to cook. And then as you started to grow in that skill, then you might find someone to help you, right? Like, hey, could you invest in me and show me how to cook and kind of walk with me through the process? And then all along the way, you're asking, hopefully, for feedback, right? I mean, I know for me with disc golf, I'm learning how to play disc golf again. And I've got a coach, believe it or not, who's watching me throw a disc. And was that right? He's like, no, that wasn't right at all. I was like, okay, well. And so he would help me and correct me. That's the way we learn a skill, right? I mean, that's the process. That's the way you learn anything. How different is it in the church? What if I told you that a strategy for learning how to be a cook was this? I was going to invite you to gather with me once a week at a building where you were going to walk in and sit in a large auditorium and listen to a man give a 40-minute lecture about how to cook. And then after you finish this lecture, you're going to sing songs about how great cooking is and how much you love to cook. And then during the week, you're going to gather with about 12 or 14 people in a home. And you're going to, again, talk about how good cooking is. And man, this is what we should do. And cooking is great. And then if you're super involved, we're going to ask you to come back to that same building and then volunteer by holding a door for other people to come to the building to hear another 40-minute lecture about cooking. The problem is you'd never go cook anything. And the question is that an effective model for training and equipping people? Well, the sad reality is that's the American church, right? I mean, that sounds very similar to what we do. And so let me ask you as we begin this myth, do you have a process for training, for equipping, for evaluating, for giving feedback, for modeling and practicing the basic spiritual disciplines and the maturity and growth that it takes to be a kingdom citizen for Jesus? Now, if you think about this, the only place this really happens in a church, and it kind of happens across the board, in churches that are passionate about missions and really try to frame missions properly, is in a short-term missions trip, right? Like think of a short-term missions trip. Normally, before you go to a country, you will gather with the team that you're going to go with. And you'll learn about the context, you'll learn about the culture, you learn about the customs, and then you'll learn how to share your faith, right? You're going to learn a practice that you're going to use on the field. And then you're going to meet periodically to practice that practice, right? You're going to go in the community. You're going to practice role-playing to others or what it looks like to share your faith. You do all this before you get on the field. And then when you get to the field, you actually, after seeing it modeled and learning and getting feedback, you're actually going to do it, right? You're actually going to share your faith. And then when you come back to the country that you left, you have a follow-up gathering where you're going to critique and say, man, this worked and this didn't work. That's the kind of strategy or model I'm talking about. Now, here's the problem. The moment that last meeting is over from the short-term mission trip, we then get you back into the American church model that is filled with programs in order to get you back into this constant teaching model where you sit passively and listen and not are expected to engage actively through participation. So here's the question. What is the solution to this? Like, how can we move our people from just hearing a lesson to living out and empowering them with training? You need to have in your church what's called a discipleship pathway for spiritual growth. A discipleship pathway for spiritual growth. Think of it as kind of guardrails or parameters that keep people focused on the direction that they're heading. Now, we do this in two ways at Long Hollow. They're called micro groups. One of those groups you've heard probably is a D group or a discipleship group. There's two different layers to that. And then there's an E group or an evangelistic group where there are two layers to that as well. What we've learned is in order to have a training center in your church, there has to be 4 different elements that are present. There always has to be these in some form or fashion, right? Number 1, there has to be some form of modeling. This is what the practice looks like. Then there has to be an evaluating aspect. Practicing, modeling and then practicing. So you have to live it out and do it. Then there's the evaluating aspect. And then finally, there's the accountability aspect. You need to have a feedback loop in order to understand if you're doing it right. One of the ways I do this in my discipleship groups is the HEAR journal. If you don't know about HEAR journals, I encourage you to go online and really investigate. Those have been the game changer in personal discipleship groups for spiritual growth. But one of the things about a HEAR journal is you log these journals based on H, highlight a text, E, explain the text you're highlighting, A, apply the text to your life, and then R, respond. And so in the first discipleship group or second, I'll say, here's how we do HEAR journals, and I'll model that for them. Then I'll challenge them to practice logging HEAR journals. Then they come back the next week and I say, why don't you share with the group so we can, quote, evaluate it. And then I give feedback or accountability and I keep them accountable to do it. And you gotta remember, one of the reasons you're not seeing people live up to the responsibility they've said they've wanted to is because there's no accountability. And the line we use here is you can't expect what you don't inspect in a person's life. If someone came up to you and said, you know what, I want to do this, I'm really excited, then what you would do is you would say, how can I train them, not just teach them to do something? The 4th ministry myth is the empowerment myth. And the empowerment myth is this idea of just because we fill spots in ministry, we have to believe we're empowering people for the work of God, right? Filling spots versus empowering people. If someone were to come up to you this week after church and say, Pastor, I want to make a difference. I want to change the world. Most of you sadly would say, great, we've been needing help in the bed babies. Can we sign you up to watch in the nursery, right? I mean, that's normally what we do. Or thanks for volunteering. We need somebody to hold a door and welcome people. Or by the way, we need some help with the student ministry. Probably all good things. But what we've done is we normally say, how can I match a pulse to a ministry, right? How can I take a corporate need in the church and meet it with a warm body? And the idea is if you're available, we have a ministry. And you know as well as I do, you can get someone to volunteer for a season, but you'll never get someone to be passionate about a ministry unless it is in their God-given calling, passions, and they're excited about it to the way where they say, I want to do this not out of duty, but out of devotion. And it's not just limited, you got to hear this. The ministry of your church is not just limited to Sunday and Wednesday night. In fact, we celebrate ministry at Long Hollow that happens off the campus because we know the kingdom obviously is way bigger than our campus. Here's the solution. The solution is, and this one you're going to say, I don't know what you're talking about, and I didn't either a couple years ago. But the solution is to find what is the God-given, unique, one-of-a-kind calling of the people who come every week to your campus. Because that's what God has done. Every person is made in the image of God and has been uniquely gifted with talents and abilities. They have gone through struggles and trials and tribulations, successes and failures. They have testimony and turmoil, and God uses all of those passions to activate their God-given calling to make a difference in their workplace, in their neighborhoods, and in their communities. See, the question I tell people is, it's not what would Jesus do, which is a good question. The question we ask is, how would Jesus live if he were you? Now think about that. How would Jesus live if he were you? If Jesus had your bank account, your house, your spouse, your family, your skills, and your giftedness. Like, what kind of life would Jesus live if he were you? Think of it this way. If Jesus was a stay-at-home mom, what kind of stay-at-home mom would he be? If Jesus was a barista at a coffee shop? What kind of barista would he be? If Jesus was a salesman, what kind of salesman would he be? We try to show Joe the plumber that he has a mission field right where he is called his workplace, and that God has brought people from all over the city to this environment where he can live, work, and play and demonstrate and show the gospel. We want to help people discover their calling. And so here's the question as we finish this one. Do you have a process for helping people discover their God-given, one-of-a-kind, unique to them passions and calling to impact the kingdom? Every person has a purpose, and God made us different to make a difference, right? Number 5, the final one, the execution myth. And this one is church impact equals ministry ownership. Making an impact in the church, I've got to be owning the ministry, and not so fast. And I want to just say before I get into this ministry myth will derail a discipleship ministry faster than any ministry or any myth in the church. And here's the thing, if you're watching, you're probably saying, we know about D groups. We have D groups. Well, we did too. And we fell into this myth early on here at Long Hollow. This is the idea that just because we have D groups going, or just because we have people engaged in life groups or small micro groups, they have to be owning these groups, right? They have to be taking ownership and responsibility. But what we found out is that people would say to us, hey, I'll lead a D group as long as you find the people, fill the spots, and then host it on campus for me to meet. Ever done that before? We affectionately used to call that D-Harmony, right? Not eHarmony, which again, I'm not against eHarmony. My sister met her husband on eHarmony. D-Harmony, discipleship harmony, right? Where you're trying to connect people together. And let me just warn you, don't ever get involved in this. It's an administration logistical nightmare, right? Trying to connect people together. Meet us at 6 o'clock in the fellowship hall where we have a D group jamboree. Don't do that, I promise you. You'll be thankful you didn't. What you're trying to do is not trying to you do all the ministry or you host all the ministry. You're trying to empower people to take ownership of the ministry. I'll give you an example. If someone were to come up to you, like I have them in the past, I've had times where they've come to me, Pastor, I feel a real passion to taking the gospel to bikers. I've actually had somebody tell me this. I really want to reach bikers for Jesus. I said, oh, really? He said, I ride a Harley every Saturday and we go on a biker ride, and I really believe we need a biker Bible study. And Pastor, we need a biker gathering, and we need vests that have biker logos with Long Hollow. I made that up. But anyway, I mean, that's the whole deal, right? The biker logos and the biker vests and the biker gatherings and the biker Bible studies. And the temptation for you as a leader is to say, let me help. Man, praise God for your passion to reach bikers, which is true. Praise God. Let me get somebody to help you get a Bible study started. That's the temptation. You know what we say? We say, Mike, that's a great passion of yours. I don't know anything about biking, but you do. And here's the line. Because you have the vision, now you get to lead the mission. That's radical, right? Because normally in most churches, if we don't own the ministry here at Long Hollow or the church, then obviously we can't take the credit. It doesn't happen. But I want to get you thinking differently to start empowering people to do the ministry and empowering them to do it in a way sometimes that may not even happen on campus. Let me remind you, Jesus called us to equip the saints, not occupy the saints or pacify the saints or even host the saints. Now here's the problem. The problem in this context is that your staff becomes so overburdened trying to break their necks to get people connected, right? In discipleship relationships, in ministry, or endorsing this or that. I'm telling you, this is a very freeing myth when you kind of break free from this and you start empowering people. If you think about it, you're probably saying, well, how do I know like if my church is doing this? Because I don't really know if my church does this. If you look at your church programming website or the church programming options that are offered, and they look more like the Cheesecake Factory menu, and listen, I love the Cheesecake Factory. I'm from New Orleans, and the Copelands I knew for years. I mean, I love the Cheesecake Factory, but the problem with the menu, if you agree, is that the moment I sit down, I am paralyzed by the options, right? I don't even know what to choose. I don't know if I should choose pizza or shrimp or pasta or veal. And don't ever turn to the back page because you'll never get off the cheesecake. I mean, there's no way to get off of there. And you think about that, you're like, man, I am paralyzed in this from even choosing anything. Friends, listen, and I say this with a lot of love. Some of you are leading churches with ministry options that are similar to the Cheesecake Factory menu. And you wonder why your people are not getting involved. You wonder why your people are paralyzed. Why? Because they don't know where to start. Remember, Paul did not say, these 10 things I dabble in. What did he say? This one thing I do. And so let me give you a solution here. The solution is, come alongside each person in your church and contextualize or create a personal disciple-making plan for them. It's a novel idea. Not some broad stroke, 30,000, everybody. No, contextualize it for them. And here's the way to think of it. Think of a map, not a menu. Think of a map, not a menu. Think of a tour guide as opposed to a person who is a travel agent. A travel agent just books the tour and says, this is where you go. A tour guide actually goes along on the journey with you. Your church doesn't have to own it, by the way, and this is a hard pill to swallow, to have an impact. In fact, it's sometimes better that they don't even know about your church and they know about Jesus, right? Obviously, it's all about him anyway. And I really think this is how we got here. I mean, I've spoken probably on the Great Commission more than many passages in the Bible, and we know the Great Commission well, right? Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son. You know this. Do you know what the American Consumer Commission is? Have you heard this before? This is the American Church Consumer Commission. Go therefore and make worship attenders, baptizing them in the name of small groups and teaching them to volunteer 1 to 2 hours a week, right? Does that sound like your church, right? I mean, that sounds like many of our churches. Now, here's the question. How do we overcome and combat these myths? I'm glad you asked. I'm going to give you one statement that I believe if we live by and labor for, can overcome all the myths I just told you about. We reclaim the model by doing this, by pushing back the finish line, by becoming hero makers, to build a training center to empower each person or each one to create a plan that they own. I don't know about you. That's something I want to give my life to, right? You know, as you think about COVID as we close, we think about how COVID was very difficult for a lot of us on many levels. But one of the things COVID gave us was a national test to see how well we have prepared our people, don't miss this, to see how well we've prepared our people to be disciple makers separate and apart from the church building. And sadly, for the church, we learned in COVID that the church, on average, flunked the tests. The church flunked the test. We failed it. Why? Because when our people couldn't come to a building and they didn't have programming and the pastor wasn't leading the charge, they were literally clueless on how to disciple their family and lead their homes and love the Lord and press in and be intimate with God. And so if you're encouraged today, and I don't want to leave you discouraged, you're saying, man, what is the point of this? The good news today is this. You're here, and just being here is part of the battle. The good news is you can make a course correction today that can really change the course of your ministry for eternity. Over the course of the last 15 years, Replicate has probably worked with thousands of churches. And we have had the benefit of assessing and learning and gathering information. And that's why we have put together an assessment. What we've done is we've taken these 5 ministry myths and we've given you a worksheet, an assessment guide that you can gauge your church to determine what myths you're actually falling into. And there's a way you can download that and you can get that. And I would encourage you to go through that with your church in the days ahead. And one of the reasons you do that is because it's time for you to stop assuming there's a problem and start investigating to see if there really is a problem. I want to close with a story of a pastor who was very tearful after a series of consulting sessions and getting to the end of the process. He was older in his ministry and only had a few years left, really. And he said to our consultant, he said, you know, I started out in ministry to make disciples. That's what I did. That's what I wanted to do. And I wanted to send them out. And it was our mission It was the statement of our church. It was the passion of our people. It was a mission statement. He said we had it on our website. We had it on the walls. He said I even had it on a coffee mug. And so he pulls this coffee mug out. Here it is. And he says, this is the mission statement of our church. We exist to make mature disciples of Jesus Christ with the ultimate goal of being a sending body of believers whose motto is, here am I, send me. With tears in his eyes, he looked at our consultant and he said, but somewhere along the way, I got caught up in church programming conferences. And I built a church that was a program-centric place and not a training center to empower and send out. And he ended with this line. It's such an encouraging line. He said, but you know what? I'm encouraged. Because before I retire and hand this off to the staff after me, I'm going to get us back to where we should have been the whole time, which is to make disciples. Friends, one of the greatest fears in life, and I'll close with this statement for you. One of the greatest fears in life I have is to succeed, not to be successful, but to be successful at things that have no eternal significance. And I believe this would help us make a course correction in the days ahead. Love you guys. Thanks for joining us. I can't wait to see what God's going to do in your church and your context in the days ahead.